Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here with the NACL Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. The preseason for the NACL has finally come to a close with every other, major region around the world having a winter split. It's felt very lackluster not having anything NACL, anything Tier 2 related at the beginning of the year here in North America, but with the OQs wrapped up, that tournament was fantastic. Obviously, if you didn't check it out, I've got quite a few VODs on my channel, 5 of them to be exact. We streamed almost every single day on this channel, the OQs. We were an official co-streamer for Citadel, so if you're interested in any of that, go check that out in the live section of this channel. But like I was saying, we've finally gotten through the OQs, we've finally gotten through the beginning part, the qualification for the NACL, and it's finally time to kick off Tier 2. I'm super excited. I know you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. This is going to be a decently controversial video just because ranking players is always a pretty controversial video, and I think especially with the way the NACL kind of turned out going into the spring split, there are quite a few teams that are, a little bit difficult to judge, a little bit difficult to kind of rate. There's a lot of unknowns going into the NACL in 2025, so I'm excited to kind of go over my expectations, to kind of go over what my grading scale is going into the year. But if you're excited, again, let me know down below. But without further ado, let's get into the video. There's so much to cover today. Obviously, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the NACL and when it comes to a lot of these teams and players, so I'll quickly go over the format that we're going to be using for the rest of the video. Of course, we will be going from number 10 to number 1 in my personal preseason power rankings. I'll be talking about where I think each of these teams' floors and ceilings will land. Typically, when we do these primers, it's a little bit different in terms of how things end up going. We'll be talking about like, oh, I absolutely think this team is a top 2 or a top 3 team no matter what. For the most part in the NACL, it's a lot more difficult to project that, and you would hope that some of these teams would grow and develop over the course of the year. That's kind of the point of a Tier 2 league in the first place, and so these are much more of like floor rankings. Like, where do I think this team's floor ends up being? Who do I think has the highest floor versus who do I think has the lowest floor? It's not necessarily which team do I think will be the best by the end of the split. I'll be talking about that in terms of like specifics as we go throughout each team. I'll kind of mention who I think will be the spring split champion. It's not always going to be number 1 in my power rankings, although I do think in this case it definitely is, so stay tuned for that. But we will be going from number 10 to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about each team. We are going to power rank each player in their individual role from number 10 to number 1, so obviously, that's going to cause at least a little bit of discussion in the comments section, but as a reminder, I always have to do this at the beginning of these videos. Not every position is created equally. That should be fairly obvious, but I do want to remind people at the beginning of this video that the number 8 jungler might not be as good as the number 8 AD carry. Just because they have the same number next to their name doesn't mean that they are the same in terms of player skill. I'll be talking about the individual specifics of each player, my thoughts and opinions on them, where I think they can grow into, where I think they're at right now as we go throughout the video. But once again, it's just kind of generally to get an idea of where teams are going to be ahead of the curve in terms of some of the teams in the league, and where I think some teams are a little bit behind the curve in terms of, again, my floor expectations. The ceilings for a lot of these players are going to be higher than where I personally rank them. There are going to be more experienced players listed above players with higher upside because, again, like I said, floor rankings, and so I can't reiterate that enough. But that's the preamble out of the way. We definitely have to do that before we get into the actual power rankings, just to establish a baseline for my expectations. But let's get into the actual content itself. Like we said, we're going from number 10 to 1, so we're going to be starting it off with the team that I have personally at number 10 in my power rankings, the team that I think has the lowest floor going into the NACL split here in 2025, and this one was not particularly difficult for me. This was, a very tumultuous offseason for this organization, but coming in at number 10, last in my power rankings, it is going to be Polestar, and I guess I should say Slated 6, Polestar / Slated 6 here coming in at number 10 for me. Obviously, this offseason has been crazy for Pulse. I'm not going to get into it on this channel. If you're watching this video, you likely already know at least a little bit about what happened to Pulse this offseason. If you don't, I'm going to leave a link down in the description to Salty Runback's video kind of covering all of the details and situations going on with Pulse. Definitely check that out if you are interested, but to kind of summarize, they had a really good team, a team that would have pretty much without a doubt come in top 3, top 4 in terms of the rankings in this video. They ended up kind of really screwing around. Those players end up leaving. There's a lot of, bad things going on. I would just say bad vibes going on inside the organization. They end up having to basically search for a team last minute to get this as quickly as possible, and lucky for them, Slated 6 was willing to accept, I presume, playing either for free or for basically no money, I would assume, playing for free here, and so they end up coming into the NACL. They were obviously in the OQs. They were an okay okay team, a decent team, but I am concerned with how they are going to translate playing against NACL talent. We'll talk about it. This isn't exactly the most stacked NACL league that we've ever had. I do think that there are some very beatable teams near the bottom of the standings. I really think the top like 3 or 4 or so are really good, and then everybody else kind of outside of that can kind of be in a lot of different orders, but for me, it's just really hard to project this org and this team to get higher than number 10. So let's quickly go over what you're seeing on the screen. Again, at the top, just the team name. You know, I put Polestar here because they're playing under the Polestar banner, but this is Slated 6 from the NACL OQs. For those of you who watched it, I kind of put how they got into the league. In Polestar's case, they were invited. They got the spot from Cincinnati Fear when that org ceased League of Legends operations, and then where I personally power rank them, of course, number 10. You can see all 5 starters across the line here, and then the number below that is going to be where I personally power rank them in their position. Unfortunately for Polestar, I do have every single player last in their role because I just don't really know what to expect out of this team. I was decently impressed with Slated 6 in terms of the tape that I watched, not only in the OQs, but going back and watching, you know, Bio play in the ACL, or Dr. Calculus play in the ACL, or Adam play in the ACL. Like, there were definitely some standout moments, but it's just really difficult for me to project a floor above number 10 for this team because I just have no idea what we're going to get out of it. So let's go ahead and go over the roster. Their roster is looking like Dr. Calculus in the top lane, Bio in the jungle, Adam in the mid lane, Hub at AD carry, and Tub at support. They played really interestingly in the OQs, not at all how I expected. Dr. Calculus and Bio are obviously the 2 players that I think have the most pedigree coming out of, like, you know, tier 3 and just generally a lot of the tournaments that we've seen recently, and they were really good in the OQs. I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that they were bad, but Hub and Tub really stood out as kind of the primary options for Slated 6, in my opinion. The bot lane was definitely a lot more of a focal point than maybe I was anticipating, and I think that that's something that's going to be interesting to monitor. Dr. Calculus, a very versatile top laner, is kind of known for carries, or at least going back a couple of years, has definitely been known for carries over the past, you know, 4 or 5 years in the tier 3 scene, but was playing a lot of things like Scion, a lot of weak side top laners to allow the rest of his team to operate. I think that that could be something that can shake up some drafts, especially in full Fearless as we go throughout the season. I think having flexibility in the NACL is a pretty important trait at the current moment. A lot of the teams near the bottom of the standings might not be as flexible, and so if you are going to be a team that maybe is not the most mechanically talented, or certainly not the most proven in the world, having that level of flexibility I think is good. Dr. Calculus definitely has that. I think Bio and Adam as a mid-jungle duo, I wouldn't necessarily consider them as flexible. Bio definitely looks a lot better on carry junglers, in my opinion, than he does on facilitators. You know, I think back to things like the Graves for Bio, that's definitely kind of the champion that stands out, but a lot of things in that realm are definitely a lot more what I think of when I think of Bio as a jungler, and Adam is definitely much more of like a melee carry, Yone style mid lane player, somebody who wants to play a little bit more aggressive. Now, this could really work out because they do generate a lot of pressure through the middle of the map, and I think especially if Dr. Calculus is going to be a little bit more of a carry on the top side, having your top side of the map be your more established side of the map for Pulse, I think is something you can absolutely play through, but I am a bit concerned whether or not Bio as a carry jungler is going to be able to get the same kinds of advantages that he was able to get so consistently at the tier 3 level. Same thing for Adam, who was just okay, in my opinion, in the OQs. I think that there were some pluses and some minuses when he went up against better talent. You know, when he went up against RJS, especially on Ducky Getters, it definitely looked a bit worse, in my opinion, but I think that there is something in here to unlock, and there is a lot of mechanical upside in these 2 players. It's all just really about whether or not they're going to be able to get that out of them in 2025. And then, like I said, Hub and Tub were, like, shockingly important towards the win condition for Slated 6 in the OQs. I really was not expecting them to be primary playmakers, but they are definitely the least proven members of any team in the NACL right now. They are the least proven NACL members. We'll see what happens with this bot lane. Again, I was impressed with Hub doing a really good job specifically in the mid game at being able to push advantages. He is a very good mid game player, and you know, I'm really intrigued to see if that ends up continuing onwards into the NACL. Again, teams are much better at being able to stop a lot of these more aggressive macro plays at this level, so we will see if, you know, Bio and Dr. Calculus can set up Hub in the way that they were able to do it in the OQs against some weaker teams. But I think Hub and Tub, obviously the Hubby-Tubby bot lane, as I think they're being referred to as, is really interesting to watch. And if they're even remotely adequate, if they're just not a bottom 1 bot lane, there is something here with Polestar. Dr. Calculus is a good player, very flexible, somebody who I'm not really all that worried about at this level. Bio and Adam have really high mechanical upside, and I think Hub and Tub have something in there to be able to unlock. Again, it's just really hard in a floor ranking to put this team above number 10. There is absolutely no floor for this team. Worst case scenario, they don't win a game, like in the NACL. I think that that's not, like, realistic, but it's possible for this team. there's just really no way to kind of tell where they're going to be from day number one. Obviously, this all came together so late. We don't even really know who's like coaching this team. Obviously, Thin Uncle Phil has gone back to Blue Otter. He will be coaching them, and obviously he coached Slated 6 in the OQs, so it's a little bit difficult to project what this team is going to look like in draft and just moving forward, but at least for now, like at least they have some players to build off of. There's just way too many question marks to come in above 10. Then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is going to be the first team that did officially qualify out of the OQs. It's Apex Mission Impossible, and for me, these were clearly the bottom 2 teams coming in to the NACL, Pulse, and AMI. Really, whatever order you wanted to put these two in, I guess, is up to you, but I definitely feel better about AMI coming in, considering just how much better they were in the OQs. There are some concerns for me when it comes to this team, but I think there is some upside in these players that I really, really like. I think they might be under-talked about at the moment because people are talking about their OQ run as being pretty disingenuous, like they were probably not a top 3 team in that tournament, but at the end of the day, they were still able to get out of there. They picked up their wins where they needed to pick them up. They beat the teams that beat the good teams, and that's why they're here. So let's go ahead and talk about it because there are some veterans on this team that I think are definitely worth mentioning. Their lineup is looking like Decoy in the top lane, Low Jazz in the jungle, Phi Mini in the mid lane, Baz at AD carry, and Pocus at support. Again, a lot of players here to kind of discuss in multiple different ways. You've got a couple of veterans, bookending, I guess, this in Decoy and Pocus. Decoy, obviously, probably the more familiar one to a lot of NACL fans, but Pocus has been around absolutely forever in Tier 3. They are not lacking in terms of ability to play out a lot of situations and to understand, how to play out mid-games. That was really something that I thought they did really well, specifically around Pocus in the OQs, and honestly, Pocus was one of the best players at that tournament, at least in my opinion. Watching the tape, I was really impressed with what he was doing in the support position. Some of the best gameplay that I've seen from him. Again, I haven't followed Tier 3 forever, but I was more impressed with Pocus at this OQ tournament than I had been in the past, and I think that's a really good thing to say. Again, Decoy is somebody that, NACL or NACL OQ fans will definitely be relatively aware of. He is a pretty interesting top laner. I was more interested in him when he was playing things like Jax in the top lane than when he was playing, Malphite and Gnar. I definitely think there was a little bit of a difference, but he can kind of flex around to whatever role that they want to play. I do think things like Malphite are definitely, things you have to look out for when playing AMI, but just set up on the top side I think is generally good. His Gnar was actually really good as well, and so I think having 2 veterans on a team that maybe doesn't have the highest expectations in the world is a pretty good thing, and I do think the middle of your map here, Low Jazz, Phi Mini, and Baz, I think they are really interesting young players. Specifically, I think mid-jungle could turn into something really, really good here. Phi Mini is definitely the player I want to talk about first. He was kind of the new addition to AMI going into the OQs that I guess kind of got them over the top, but I've been really impressed with Phi Mini and with his mechanical ceiling. I think that there is a world where he is, I don't want to say like the next like Toasty Alex or whatever, because I just can't say the next Samikin. I can't say that about anybody. It's really hard to kind of put that on, pen to paper or anything like that to say that and feel confident about it at this level when they've not really had any experience, but his mechanical ceiling is ridiculous. I absolutely do believe that there is a world where, Phi Mini in a year or 2 is being considered for an upper echelon NACL team, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised. For now, there are still a lot of mistakes. There is still a lot of growing that needs to be done. There's a lot of inconsistency. I think things like the Akali definitely feel more natural, but we saw throughout the tournament, they're happy to go to things like Victor. They're willing to pull out things like Mbessa mid if they really need to. Phi Mini definitely has a bit more of a flexible champion pool than you're going to get out of a lot of the other bottom mid laners or the expected, like, less proven mid laners at this level, and I think that that's definitely something that plays in AMI's favor. Low Jazz and Baz are definitely the 2 players that have the most to prove, in my opinion. Low Jazz was pretty solid. Obviously, Shibby's somewhere out there, putting him in number 1 in terms of these rankings, but Low Jazz still has a lot to grow and improve on. I think that there were a lot of mistakes in the back half of the game, very unclean gameplay, even with leads, and I think that that's something that absolutely has to be cleaned up from Low Jazz. If that can be cleaned up, there is mechanical talent there. I especially really liked how good Low Jazz looked on facilitators, because I do think right now in the meta, it's just a lot easier to be able to build comps around Sejuani and Maokai and things like Vi than it is to build around, more carry-oriented picks. Not that you can't do it. We've seen things like Nidalee, work really well internationally, but it's just a lot more consistent. I think right now to build around those facilitators, and if you're really good at those champions, then I think things get a lot easier. Again, Low Jazz can sometimes be a bit too far forward, especially in the back half of the game on a lot of those champions, but when you do allow him to get leads for the rest of the team, he's pretty decent in that role. Baz is the player I'm the most concerned about. I'm just going to be straight up going into into this split. I'm really not super sold on Baz as an AD carry that's going to be able to survive. ADC, I think, is a super good role at the NACL level. I know a lot of people have talked as if it isn't. I really don't agree with that assessment. I believe at the bare minimum, it's like 8 players deep in terms of quality players that I'm actually really excited to see at the tier 2 level. I have a hard time believing that Baz is going to be able to compete with a lot of those players. The only reason he comes in above Hub is because we've just seen a lot more of Baz, at least in terms of, I've seen a lot more of Baz. I feel better about the floor of Baz, but I don't think that those two players are really all that far off in terms of expectation. I think that there is a world where the bot lane's not particularly good, especially in the 2v2 here at this level, and if that's going to be an issue, like, that's going to be pretty unovercomable. I do think there are some positives to talk about, though. Again, maybe Fimini has like a pseudo breakout. I think in terms of players that I'm expecting to be, you know, potential like actual good players at the tier 2 level, Fimini is probably top of the list for me for AMI as a breakout candidate. I'm not sure it's going to happen on this team, but it's definitely possible. I also think it's worth noting that top lane in general at the NACL level right now, not the deepest position. You really go like 2, 3, or 4 deep in terms of players you feel good about, and then basically like 6 downwards are all the same grade. If you want to decoy at like 6 or 7, I'm not even really going to complain all that much. I don't think there really is that big of a difference between the 6th and the 9th best top laner in the NACL, and so Decoy could be able to hold his own more than you would expect naturally from a player of his experience level, but again, it's just difficult to project anything more than a near bottom finish for AMI. I do think they're better than Polestar. I certainly think they have a higher floor than Polestar. We just saw that in the OQs. Like, AMI was just better than Slated 6, and I would expect that to continue in the NACL, but I think it's pretty clear that these are the bottom 2 teams, and I really would be shocked if either of them like completely outperform that. We've seen some breakout candidates in years past. Maybe AMI could be this year's version of like 2023 Cincinnati Fear or 2024 Blue Otter, where people were just not really expecting all that much out of them, and they turned that into a really good split. I think it's possible for this team. I just would more so bet against it, and I would more so bet that they're probably going to be near the bottom as well. But then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is where things I think really start to get a bit more interesting. No offense to the bottom 2 teams, I just think in a floor ranking, it's really hard to put those 2 teams anywhere other than bottom 2. I think this is where you start to get to the part of the list where there might be some disagreements, but coming in at number 8 for me, it is going to be Winthrop University. I do think that they are probably the weaker of the 2 collegiate teams, at the very least right now in this tournament, in the NACL. I think we've seen that a bit in the CLAL season. Those 2 teams have faced off twice, and I think generally speaking, I have a slightly better opinion of Ole Miss, but we'll talk about them a bit more later. Let's go ahead and talk about Winthrop right now, because I do think there are things to like about Winthrop, and I don't think this is a team that you can overlook really at all. I was more concerned about them before, you know, we kind of saw that Pulse and AMI were, you know, the bottom 2 teams in the league. I thought that they would be a lot closer to number 9, but I do think that they are a tier above kind of the bottom tier teams in my opinion right now. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Denethor in the top lane, Wilson in the jungle, Sword in the mid lane, Mobility at 80 carry, and only 35 at support. Really no other place to start for this team other than the bot lane. If they are going to succeed at this level, it is going to be through Mobility, and it's going to be through only 35. These are the 2 best players on the team, regardless of what you see in terms of these player rankings, and even with what you see in terms of these player rankings. Only 35 is the best player on Winthrop. Obviously, longtime international fans are going to remember this guy for playing on Fenerbahce many years ago in the TCL. He represented Turkey at MSI, I think in like 2019. He was on that team with like Balulu and like Kirei. Like there were like real players on that team. He played for so long in Turkey. He was playing in, you know, EMEA Masters last year. And so this guy has a ridiculous amount of experience being successful at levels that are even higher than the NACL, or at the very least comparable to the NACL. And it's not just the track record that I'm kind of relying on here to rate this guy relatively highly. Watching some CLAL tape of him so far in 2025, he is really good. He is definitely the best player on Winthrop. I think that that was very clear to me watching a lot of the tape, and that's not to take anything away from the rest of this roster. I actually just think that he is a very good player that would be even better on a better team, right? I'm not trying to say that Winthrop is awful, just that, you know, they're not exactly the most, you know, proven team in the entire universe in terms of the players that are here, and I think only 35 is a big reason why I think they are a full tier above the bottom 2 teams. But we can also talk about Mobility in kind of a similar way. I really do think the 2 CLAL 80 carries that are kind of coming up here in 2025, both Mobility and Shogo, who we will talk about later, are ridiculously talented. The mechanics on both of them I think are absolutely absurd, and I honestly am really excited to see both of them. I think there's a real shot that one of them becomes this previous years, like levitate style player where the mechanics are just so clear at the tier 2 level that it's way too obvious that they should be near the top and they can elevate a team. And I think that this is a pretty decent spot for Mobility to be able to do that. The problem with Mobility is he's just not the most consistent player in the world. You're going to have some good games and you're going to have some bad games. You just kind of got to live with that. But like I said, with Winthrop, like the bot lane is really what you're going to want to focus on. That's definitely going to be the part of the map that I think is going to win them the most amount of games. Not that everybody else on this team is bad. In fact, there are quite a few very experienced players here. You could argue that Mobility being like the least experienced player at this level is, you know, kind of a factor that might go against Winthrop because Denethor played in the NACL last year and, you know, Trickster or Wilson, I should say, has been around forever, and Sword obviously has played in the NACL many times over for many, many years, going back to the Academy days here in North America. So, you know, I think that is the concern for the bot lane, is that the experience might catch back up to them. But I think in terms of raw talent, I would expect this bot lane to be the part of the map that's winning a lot of games for Winthrop. That's not to say, again, that others can't win it, just that I'm a little bit more neutral on a lot of the other players. Sword has always been a fine player at this level, but certainly not somebody that's been exceptional. He's been fine as a mid laner and as a support at this level. I'm just not overly excited about Sword. Maybe he overperforms my expectations, but at least for now, I think he will do well against mid laners that are mediocre or a little bit worse. I don't think he's going to like push the upper bounds of what this team is capable of, at least moving forward. I don't think he's going to drive them into being like a top 4 or top 5 team, which I do think is possible, by the way, for basically anybody from this point onwards. Same thing for Wilson, you know, Trickster, Wakao, whatever you want to call him. He's played by many names over the years. He is also just a good, not great jungler. I'm really not all that impressed with Wilson. We will see what ends up happening with him finally getting a shot at tier 2. He's been kind of rumored to be a starting tier 2 jungler for quite a long time, but he's never actually gotten that full run of things. This is really going to be his opportunity to get that tier 2 opportunity, or that tier 2 chance, I should say, not trying to repeat my words too much, but I'm just not quite sure if he's going to be able to handle like the best junglers in the league. And then we saw what Denethor was for the most part last year in the NACL. He's fine. He's an okay player. Again, I think anywhere from like 6 to 9 in terms of, you know, top lane rankings is all relatively similar. These are all players that I think on any given day can have decently good laning performances, decently good, you know, performances in the back half of the game, especially if they have leads and, you know, if they're going into it with a gold advantage. But I don't think they're necessarily going to be able to be dominant in the same way that the top 2, especially top laners in the NACL are, but really even like the top 4 in terms of mechanical upside. So Denethor comes in kind of in that bottom cluster. I don't think he's a bad player by any means. He is obviously the only player returning from Winthrop when they did play in the NACL last year, but overall, I still think that if you're going to focus on this team, if you're going to focus on a win condition for them, it's basically got to be Mobility and only 35. I think this bot lane is what impressed me the most and where I think they have the most room to grow in terms of upside. If they're just going to be what they've been so far in 2025 in CLOL, that's probably around the 8th best team. That's probably good enough to avoid the relegation tournament, which is really all this organization is probably looking for at the current moment. They just want to stay in the NACL, get an opportunity to get these players some experience. I think that that will happen, but I do think there is a universe, especially because I think there's a lot of floor for players like Sword and Wilson and Denethor, where the bot lane can elevate them into being, you know, borderline top 5, and if that's the case, that's going to be really fun to watch. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and we're going to be completing the CLOL kind of duo here back to back, as number 7 for me is going to be Supernova, or I guess more specifically Ole Miss coming in here. Obviously, Ole Miss, the roster that they have is playing under the Supernova banner. Makes a lot of sense. Ole Miss has been one of, if not the most successful CLOL programs over the course of the last few years. Winthrop, obviously SLU is up there as Maryville. I can't believe I didn't even mention Maryville, obviously, who's in that as well. But, you know, Ole Miss has a lot of players that I think have more than deserved a shot in the NACL for a little while, and I'm really interested to see how they do. I think they are better than Winthrop. I think that they have kind of proven that, at least a little bit recently. It's not perfect. It's definitely not, like, guaranteed, but for now, they come in at number 7 in my ranking, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Stray in the top lane, Keel in the jungle, Asila in the mid lane, Shogo at AD carry, and Rhino at support. Again, a lot of players who longtime NACL fans, or even longtime international fans, might be familiar with, very similar to what we talked about with only 35 on Winthrop. You have Stray here in the top lane for Supernova, obviously formerly of Movistar over in LatAm. He was able to kill Faker at MSI. A lot of people are going to remember him for that, but you've got players like Keel on this team that have been, you know, successful and longtime NACL players for multiple different organizations. You've got really hyped up young players or players that are kind of looking to make an impact at the very least in tier 2 in, you know, players like Shogo and Asila, and, you know, Rhino's been around the block for quite a long time. He's played in tier 2 as a substitute for Team Liquid before, and so You've got a lot of experience on this team, and I do think you kind of have the upside as well that I'm looking for. I think of all the teams that I think are in the bottom 4, which I will say, I think that there are tiers in the NACL. Bottom 2 is kind of its own tier. I think, 7 and 8, the 2 collegiate teams, are kind of their own tier. I think 4, 5, and 6 are kind of their own tier in terms of teams that maybe aren't expected to be top tier, but, should be better than, 8th place, like should not be at all concerned about being in the relegation tournament. And then I think top 3 are the 3 best teams in the NACL. I think Supernova is the best team outside of that top 6, the team that I feel could break out the most convincingly to me, and that's mostly because of a lot of their veterans and I think a lot of their upside as well. So we'll get into it. Kiel is obviously the first player to talk about here. Kiel is exceptionally good, and I'm tired of people pretending like he isn't. I don't really understand why people are knocking Kiel down a lot. This guy was a finalist for MVP in 2023 in the NACL when he was playing on Wildcard, when he was pulling out a lot of his weird picks, game in and game out, things like the Nunu, things like the Karthus that were really working for Wildcard during that time. Obviously, he wasn't as successful on Team Liquid, I would say, in 2024, but it's not like they had a bad year, all things considered. That Team Liquid Challengers team was still very, very good, and so for Kiel to be here on Supernova and to be starting for this team, like, he's really, really talented, and he can play a lot of different roles. I think one of the big things that always has impressed me the most about Kiel in terms of playstyle, if you're unfamiliar with him, is not only the weird picks, but he is allergic to being passive. He is absolutely allergic to not doing anything. He is the most active jungler you will ever find, and that doesn't mean he's always forcing plays. It does sometimes mean he can force plays and get himself into a bit of trouble, but he is always setting things up. He's never going to try and wait for the game to come to him. He's going to go to the game, and I think that that is generally a really good trait to have at this level, especially because I don't think the talent in the NACL is as good as maybe it was last year when he was getting punished a bit more for that. So I feel pretty good about Kiel. He's definitely the biggest reason why this team is coming in at number 7 and why I think they could come in theoretically a bit higher if you wanted to put them there. And then the other player that I just really like on this team is, of course, Shogo in the AD carry role. Shogo is exceptionally good, and I don't know if I'm, like, alone on this because I see a lot of people talking about Shogo and mobility as if they're very close. I think Shogo is the, like, if there's gonna be a Levitate this year, if there's gonna be a player to come up to tier 2 and really just break out and kind of prove that they should have been here all along, I think it probably will be Shogo. I feel really good about that. If the duo for Winthrop is mobility and only 35, the duo for Supernova is Kiel and Shogo, but I think you also have Stray, I think you also have Rhino, I think you also have Asila, and so I just feel really good about this. I think if Shogo turns out to be like a mechanical god, I'm really not going to be all that shocked. He's a smart player who makes a lot of good decisions. He likes to play hyper carries, but he is really good at a lot of those more standard ADCs, things like Varus and Ezreal and Ashe. Like, he can pick up basically anything. They can play around him, they can play weak side for him. He's just a really good player, and I think him and Rhino do have a lot of good chemistry together. Rhino's always been a player that I thought had good tape. I've never really seen him as like a superstar, but I do think he's more than good enough to be able to play here at the tier 2 level, and I think Shogo and Rhino should be a more than serviceable bot lane. And then, like I said, your solo laners maybe are the part where you're a bit more concerned. I'm not as concerned about Stray. Again, I don't want to keep repeating myself. I feel really bad to continuously say the same things over and over again, but 6 to 9-ish, like all of these bottom-ish tier teams in the NACL in terms of top laners, you can kind of put these top laners in any order that you want. I think Stray has been impressive at times, especially as a frontliner. I think that that's where he's been the most consistent, but he's not the best laner in the world. We've definitely seen times where things have not been ideal for him in the 1v1s if he gets in a bad matchup or if he gets counterpicked. We saw that against Winthrop, and so it's not the most consistent, top lane in the world, but there's not a lot of consistent top laners at the NACL level. I'm not worried about Stray, and again, that international experience theoretically should be a bonus for him. It's more so Asila in the mid lane, and it's not even that I think Asila is bad, it's more so that I'm just really not sure what we're going to get out of Asila at the tier 2 level. You'll notice that he's coming in below, players we've already talked about lower on the power rankings, players like Mini who have never played in the NACL, a player like Sword who's played in the NACL but has never really shined at the tier 2 level. I'm just a bit more concerned about the 1v1 prowess of Asila when he's going into the best mid laners in the region, players like Pobelter or players like Insanity. Like, I just worry a bit more about what Asila is going to be able to do from a game-to-game basis against those players. I still think he should be more than good enough, but especially because I think this roster was, trying to push and consider Shochi for a long time as a starting mid laner, this definitely feels like a bit more of a hope and pray that Asila is in a spot where he's actually going to be able to compete with a lot of the rest of the players at tier 2, but I think for the most part, I feel much better about Supernova than I do about, Winthrop and especially the bottom 2 teams. if only because I think Kiel is just going to win them games. I think that there are multiple teams in the NACL, good teams, like teams that are in a tier above Supernova, that are going to have trouble dealing with Kiel by himself, and I think Shogo is more than good enough to be able to be a primary, like, carry option to be able to receive a lot of those resources from Kiel. If one of Stray or Asila can turn into that secondary carry that can win lane, at least kind of consistently, or stay neutral in lane and be a big team fight threat, then I think this team is going to be very dangerous, and I don't think they're going to be near relegation. I honestly would be surprised if they were in that zone. I think what would have to go wrong is that, jungle would have to be a lot worse than I'm anticipating, and I'm just not expecting that to happen. Supernova is an interesting team, but still kind of a tier down from the teams that I think have a shot to be able to surprise people this year. But now moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is kind of the start of what I would consider the B tier in NACL. These are teams that I'm maybe not expecting to win the entire league or to compete to win the entire league, but if you want actual good NACL teams that are very clear of relegation that I think could theoretically break through if some things kind of turn right for them, it starts here at number 6, and unfortunately coming in at the bottom of B tier, but still in a pretty decent spot for me, is going to be Conviction, obviously formerly Tempest Gaming, to qualify out of the OQs. They were the team that qualified out of the lower part of the bracket. They beat Citadel 2-1 in the final series of the entire tournament. It was a very close series, one that a lot of people thought should have gone 5 games, but at the end of the day, they won the games that they needed to win in order to get in here to the NACL. They end up, getting merged or bought out or something with Conviction here, who's going to be able to pay the salaries of a lot of these players in the NACL, which is obviously a huge positive, but there's, again, reason to believe that this team is going to be pretty competitive, that they're not just going to get into the NACL and be whatever, right? Like AMI gets into the NACL, their hope is to stay in the NACL. Their hope is to not relegate going into summer. Conviction, I think, has higher hopes than that, and I think it is possible for them. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Hoarder in the top lane, Kisno in the jungle, Darkwings in the mid lane, Aaron at AD carry, and Manui at support. This is really where we're starting to get to teams that have consistent NACL talent, players who have played at this level not only a couple of times before, but have played at this level regularly. You're seeing players, obviously, like Kisno, Darkwings, Aaron, Manui, who have spent so much time on top-tier teams at this level. A player like Manui has been top 3 in the NACL before. A player like Aaron was really successful at the end of last year, was one of the big breakouts, in my opinion, at the end of 2024, kind of up there with Levitate in terms of the performances he was giving in the AD carry role. You have a player in Kisno who looked great considering he was on kind of a bad team his first stint in the NACL, and Darkwings has been in tier 2 for quite a long time, even going back to the days where he was in like Dignitas's system. And so it's really just Hoarder who has like less experience at this level, but as you can see, like in terms of the top lane rankings, I think he's the best of that big cluster of top laners that are relatively inconsistent, not particularly proven at this level, but could be really good. I think Hoarder's mechanics kind of put him above a lot of those other players. So we'll go ahead and get into that as we go throughout. But really, the strength of this team, the strength of Conviction, and the way that I think they're probably going to win is once again probably going to be through bot lane and mostly through Aaron. I think he is kind of the pseudo star of this team. Aaron really impressed me at the end of 2024. I was always relatively high on Aaron. I never thought that he was going to be like a tier 3 player. Like, he is clearly a strong tier 2 player, and he has been for a little while. But really, that last like 3 to 4 week stretch at the end of summer in 2024, I was like, oh my god, this guy's incredible, and he's not getting nearly enough attention. I think his mechanics are absolutely absurd. I think he showcased that in the OQs as well, where he was like genuinely an absolute monster. And I think when you're looking for a reason to like Conviction more than this number 6 ranking, Aaron kind of breaking out and being a top 3 or a top 480 carry, like that's the reason that could happen. And honestly, that's not out of the realm of possibility. That's a pretty realistic outcome if he continues to upgrade in the trajectory that he's been on recently. Again, I'm not guaranteeing that will happen. I think there are some things kind of pushing against him in that regard, but at least for now, I think the bare baseline level is that he's like a top 4 or top 5 80 carry in the NACL. I really do think he is that good. The other player that I feel pretty good about at the NACL level has always been Darkwings. A longtime followers of the channel, like people who have been watching since like 2022 or 2023, will know that I used to be super in on Darkwings when we were talking about him in Academy. I was really kind of hyping him up as a player that I think could have been the next big breakout mid laner in tier 2. It never really happened, though. The big problem for Darkwings is he's just so inconsistent from a game-to-game basis. You'll see some unbelievable performances from him, and when he wins incredibly hard. He is a really, really good player when he he ends up with a lead and he's actually able to just completely destroy games with a gold advantage. The problem is when he loses early and when the team doesn't give him a ton of support, he can sometimes kind of run it a bit. Like, he is just not a particularly consistent player. Hopefully that's something that he can start to weed out of his system, but I think as a secondary option on this team behind Aaron, I think that that is a much more understandable role to have, but it really caps out as like a top 5 mid laner in the NACL. I still think he's a very good, very talented player, but again, that inconsistency is just something that comes along with him, and I think you could say the same thing for Kisno. I was really impressed with Kisno the first time he was in the NACL. He was given a really rough go of things in terms of the team that he had around him, and I think he kind of was the best player on that team, certainly performed the best of all of the players on that team, and I think coming back into the NACL here, I'm hoping to see him take that next leap up. I'm kind of grading him as such. I think he is a player that still has a lot to prove, but at least for now, like, the floor to me is like a top 7 jungler in the NACL, which is more than good enough. And then another player with a lot to prove is Manui in the support position. Talk about a player that really kind of has a lot to show in 2025, not because Manui hasn't been successful at this level, but because he is role swapping to the support position. He's obviously been a successful AD carry for both Cincinnati Fear in 2023 and then Disguised last year after he ended up coming back when Tomo, got picked up by 100 Thieves up in the LCS. But I kind of really like this role swap for him. I talked about this a bit in the offseason when we were doing the streams for the OQs, that I think Manui's skill set works really well as a support player. I think obviously you think back to things like the Seraphine that worked really well for him as an AD carry in the NACL, but really when I think of his skill set, I think about really good mid-game skirmishes and really good positioning in team fights, and I think that that's something that you can get away with as a support a little bit more than an AD carry. He doesn't need to have as much lane prio. I don't think he's ever been like a dominant lane player. That being said, he was just okay as a support in the OQs. I definitely think there still is a lot of growth to be done there, but as an engage player, I thought he was a lot more advanced than I was expecting, and as an enchanter player, I was kind of expecting a bit more, so it's probably meeting somewhere in the middle in terms of those expectations. Again, right now, it's just more difficult to rank him above 7th, but he's got the skill set and the tools to be able to be a top 3 or a top 4 support, and I don't even really feel all that, concerned about saying that. And then again, Hoarder is the only player here who has never played in Tier 2 before. He's been in, the OQs over and over again, the qualification series for the NACL over and over again, but this is the first time that he's actually been able to punch his ticket up to Tier 2. I was super impressed with Hoarder in terms of the tape that I saw in the OQs, specifically this split. Again, him just completely outplaying Philip in that game number 3 to qualify them for this tournament or for the NACL for Tier 2 is a big reason why they're here at all. I really was impressed with Hoarder. His mechanical ceiling is really high if you get him into good matchups, and again, top lane's just not a particularly deep position in the NACL. I think that there is room for one of these guys to break out, and I think of all of the players that are a little bit less established, Hoarder is the one that I would kind of put my money on being the most successful here in 2025, but just generally with Conviction, you're looking at a pretty solid team across the board. My only concern is that right now, I'm not sure you have like a breakthrough star. That could be Aaron, but there are a couple of other teams that we're going to talk about above them that either are a bit more consistent and a bit more proven across the board, or have a player that I think could be a top 3 player in the entirety of the NACL by the end of 2025. I'm not sure Conviction really have either of those. I think the floor for this team is a little bit lower than some of the teams above them, because I just don't know what we're going to get out of Hoarder or Kisno or Manui. There is a world where they're below average in their positions, and even if Darkwings and Aaron are solid, this team is a lot closer to being what Wildcard was last year than they are to being, like an actually really good team here in the NACL. But there's also a world where Aaron breaks out, is an upper echelon guy. Kisno, Manui, and Hoarder are all above average in their role, and this is a top 4 team in the NACL. I really don't think that that is like a weird thing to not expect. I think that that's totally possible. The difference between number 4 and number 6 is not large, and Conviction, I'm really excited to see what this team can do in the NACL, because I think that there is a lot of potential with this team. But now that we've crossed the halfway mark, it's time to jump into the top 5 in my power rankings, and that kicks off with number 5, which for me is CCG Esports. Some people might think that this is too high for this team, which honestly, I don't entirely disagree with. If you wanted this team at number 6 and if you wanted Conviction at number 5, I honestly feel pretty good about that. I think this team's floor is a little bit higher than Conviction's in my opinion. I think you have more players that I just feel better about moving forward. I don't think the difference in terms of star players is as big as it is between other teams, but I absolutely do think that there is a chance that, especially with the form that Tempest or Conviction is in right now, that they are just better. But for me, I just really like this CCG roster, and I think they're constructed in a really positive way. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Crimson in the top lane, Dardoch in the jungle, Aojun in the mid lane, Array at AD carry, and Breezy at support. You've got a lot of really experienced NACL players here, which you're going to basically hear from this point onwards. I think actually everybody from this point onwards is either experienced at the NACL level or TF Blade, who we will obviously talk about a bit later. So, we'll get into all of that. But for CCG, again, you're just looking at a lot of players that I think have performed really well in Tier 2 in the past. And I think you have a ton of mechanical upside here. I think you have two players that I think have the potential to break out, and the floor is pretty high. I think your floor, I guess, kind of lanes are really good on this team. The floor lane for me is bot lane here, Array and Breezy. These are players that I think are really solid for the Tier 2 level. Breezy has been more than a consistent performer in the NACL basically his entire career. This guy has basically lived at Tier 2 on multiple different organizations with multiple different bot lane partners going back many, many years, and so you feel good about Breezy being here for CCG. At times, it looked like it was going to be a bit up in the air who was going to be starting for support for this team because, Breezy obviously started the year with Nightmare, and Nightmare ends up folding, and CCG I think kind of lucks out in that regard to be able to pick Breezy up and get him for the NACL. But Breezy is solid, and Array is also a really solid bot laner. I think people sometimes forget that Array is really good, that he's had a couple of breakout performances in the past for Golden Guardians Academy, or a couple of other teams in the past as well. Like, he's just performed like a really consistently good AD carry at the Tier 2 level. And what I mean by a floor lane here for Array and Breezy is that I don't think they necessarily have the same kind of upside. Like, I don't think Array has the same kind of upside to me as, like, Shogo, or especially as, like, Aaron that we just talked about, but I think the floor for Aaron and Breezy as a bot lane is so much higher than almost any other bot lane that we've talked about so far, because I can just not really imagine a world where they are bad, where they're anything below, like, an average NACL bot lane, which is really all they need to be for this team in order to be successful. You're not relying on Array and Breezy to be dominant. Now, Array can have some pop-off performances. He's really good with resources if you do end up wanting to play for him, but I don't think you need to. I think they offer the flexibility to be weak side or strong side, and I think generally speaking, they're going to be good in the 2v2. Again, just a super stable, super consistent bot lane, which a lot of teams at this level just don't have, so I feel good about that. And then I think you're looking at Dardoch in the jungle as the other kind of floor player, the player that you kind of know what you're going to get out of him. He's become a lot more consistent, I think, the older he's gotten and the more he's played. I think obviously we knew Dardoch in the LCS for many years as this feast or famine, very risky jungler who was a great carry but could also run any game down basically at any point, was going to lead the league in deaths basically no matter what the circumstance was, regardless of how well he was playing. I don't think that's Dardoch anymore. It's just not the version of him that we've seen, whether it's in jungle or as a support. He's been a pretty consistent presence in both, and I think he offers a level of consistency to this team that, again, a lot of other teams just aren't going to be able to match. Now, the concern with Dardoch is I just haven't loved his mechanical upside in recent years. I don't think he's ever looked like he's, like, on the verge of re-breaking out at the Tier 2 level. But that being said, I wouldn't feel bad about having Dardoch as the starting jungler. Dardoch, Array, Breezy, very experienced players at this level. And even Crimson, somebody who played the entire year last year for CCG and ended up playing in the NACL for this org with a good team around him. He was fine. Honestly, there were times where I was impressed with him. He is a bit feast or famine, but you kind of just take that with a lot of NACL top laners. Like, top laners at the Tier 2 level, there are very few that are like, I'm solid on weak side. Like, it's just not really how a lot of top laners come up through the system. Crimson is definitely somebody who is a bit more, risky in terms of the plays that he's going to go for. The good games look really good, the bad games kind of look bad, but the mechanical ceiling is definitely still there, and I like that CCG has clearly prioritized keeping him around, not only this year, but last year as well. He was the player that they ended up, or one of the players that they ended up retaining from that qualification team in the OQs in the first place. They clearly love whatever they see in Crimson, and that gives me a lot of confidence to say that the good stuff that we see on tape is a lot more common in scrims than maybe the bad stuff is. So I feel good about Crimson. He comes in like a half tier above, I would say, all of the top laners that we talked about up until that point, but really, what I think is going to make or break this team is how good Aljun is in the mid lane. I really like Aljun's tape. I was really impressed watching Aljun and Kryra as a mid-jungle duo in the ACL, and that was basically the last time we saw Aljun play, but I'm going to be honest, like, his floor is really high. I think that there is a chance that he is just a good mid laner from day number one, especially because he gets to play with Dardoch and he gets to play with Breezy, and a lot of these players that I think are going to make the transition a lot simpler for him. I really would be shocked if he came in and was bad. I just was really impressed, I guess, with what the floor is looking like for him. And I think the ceiling is really high as well. If there is a player that is going to break out in terms of, like, over exceeding expectations and getting CCG higher than number 5, I would guess it's probably Aljun in the mid lane. I really do think that highly of him. I think Array will likely lead this team in terms of, like, damage per minute, and, he's probably going to be the one with the most amount of resources because I think they're going to feel most comfortable playing through him. And then I think Crimson, in good matchups, if he gets counterpick, is likely going to be able to, really express that. But Aljun is really what I'm looking at for this team to be able to take it it to the next level. And if he has good synergy with Dardoch, who's to say that that can't happen? So I feel pretty decent about CCG. Again, if you wanted to put them at number 6, I think that that's totally fair. Like, CCG versus Conviction is really up to you. I think Conviction has higher upside with a player like Aaron, who I think is the closest to being a star out of the 10 players on both of those teams, but I think CCG's floor is just higher, and that's what we're talking about here. This is a floor ranking. The floor of Dardoch, Array, and Breezy is just really high. I very much doubt that this team is going to be bottom 3. Like, I just don't think there is a universe where that ends up happening. So I feel good about CCG, maybe even a bit better than what the general consensus seems to be on this team. But now we get to move on to number 4 in my power rankings, and like I said, this is kind of the top of B tier. I think the top 3 teams are pretty clear for a lot of people, at least in terms of expectations going into this split, but coming in just outside of that top 3 for me, it is going to be Blue Otter, and obviously there's a lot of talk, a lot of conversation surrounding Blue Otter because they did kind of pseudo break out at the end of summer last year where they just overperformed expectations so much. It felt like this was like a top 3 or top 4 team in the NACL by the end of the season. And, you know, maybe the results didn't necessarily match that entirely, but a couple of these players looked so incredible in their small stint at the top of the standings that there's reason to believe that it will only get better moving forward. Obviously, it's super encouraging that all 5 are retained and are able to be kind of run back here in 2025, and, you know, that continuity should serve them really well early on in this tournament, but there is a question of whether or not that was an outlier or whether or not that was a repeatable performance, I guess, if you kind of look at the end of 2025. But we'll go over it as we go over the roster here. Their lineup is looking like Quacker in the top lane, Music in the jungle, Samikin in the mid lane, Levitate at AD carry, and Rovex at support. Again, there's a lot to like about this team. Obviously, bringing all 5 back together is just such an inherent advantage because the communication is there basically from day number 1. Now, I know a lot of the other teams are retaining most of their rosters at the top of the standings here. You talk about even a team like Near Airport that obviously we'll get into. Like, they've played together multiple times before. They know how to communicate with each other, but, you know, the other 2 teams that are going to be in the top 3, they are also, you know, for the most part, players that are very familiar with playing with each other. And Blue Otter has that advantage as well, but I think the difference is obviously it's all 5 members of Blue Otter. There's nobody that I'm scared of not being on the same page as the rest of this team. There's nobody where I'm like, well, you know, this team was good with this piece last year, but are they going to be good with this piece this year? There's no thought of that here with Blue Otter because you just kind of know that they're going to be good as a group of 5. That being said, there is some expectation for me for them to kind of, I don't want to say crash back down to earth, but, you know, return to normalcy a bit. Normalcy to me is number 4 in the NACL, but I still think that's a pretty good ranking, so we can kind of go through this. Their star player, I think at this point, is abundantly clear, and that is Levitate in the bot lane. He is a future star here in the NACL. Again, if this was not a floor ranking, if this was an upside ranking, you could convince me that Levitate should be top 2 or top 3 in terms of the AD carries in the NACL, but at the end of the day, I'm just not like convinced that he's going to be that basically from day number 1. The 3 top AD carries in the league right now are just ridiculously good, and so it's hard for me to think that Levitate is like better than them, but if you wanted to put Levitate at number 3 especially, I think I could really get behind that. Like, that's how good Levitate is right now. I think that there is a world by the end of the year where we're talking about him as an LTA player in 2026. I really don't think it's all that out of the realm of possibility. I think he's more than talented enough. It's more so just about whether or not he can put it together. It was his first full year in the NACL in 2024, and he completely broke out by the end of the year. To me, he was the best performing AD carry outside of Scary Jerry in 2024. If he does that again, like, Blue Otter are going to be just fine. And a big reason for that is because I do really like Rovex as well in the support position. There was an earlier draft of these positional rankings, kind of going through this like earlier on in the offseason around January or February when I was doing a lot of the other primers for other videos, where I had Rovex as a top 2 support in the NACL. And again, I still don't really feel like he's all that far off from being that. Rovex is a lot more of a part of why this team broke out last year than he gets credit for. And I think he's pretty clearly the 2nd best player on Blue Otter. I get that there are players with numbers that are a little bit lower. You know, Quacker's the number 3 top laner, and Levitate and Rovex are both number 4 in their positions. But like I said, please remember, you know, the positions are not created equally. AD carry is a better role in the NACL than top lane is. Support is a better role in the NACL than top lane is, at least at the top end level. And so You feel pretty good about Levitate and Rovex. They're definitely the stars of this team, but it's not like anybody is like a weak link on this team, in my opinion. You've got Quacker in the top lane, who I've really gone to bat for on this channel over the past 2 years, essentially. I've constantly been in Quacker's corner in terms of defending him when he makes a lot of those weird, more over-aggressive plays, because I just think the mechanical talent is out of this world if you can harness it. I don't punish top laners nearly as hard in the NACL for being Feast or Famine as I would in other regions, because you kind of want to see that mechanical ceiling in order to break out. And also, I just think it's a lot easier to be able to get away with that in a region or in a league like the NACL, where the top lane talent isn't quite as deep. I think Quacker is just better than a lot of the players that are coming up right now from tier 3 to tier 2, and I think he's going to be able to exert that with the role itself getting weaker. I think Quacker's advantages are going to go up again. If you wanted him closer to number 4, number 5, that's probably where I would feel better about having him, but a lot of the top laners that I would put above him that were kind of, you know, near the top of these rankings, players like Dokla or players like Tenacity, that definitely would have been, you know, above Quacker on these lists. They're not in the league, and so it ends up with Quacker being at number 3. Samikin was kind of another big breakout star from last year. I'm a little bit less sold that Samikin himself is going to be a superstar, and more so that I think he works really well with this team. And honestly, is there really much of a difference, like in terms of, you know, making that statement? Maybe that's a superfluous statement, but at the end of the day, Samikin's a really good mid laner. I think he does have more of a style than someone like Levitate does in terms of, you know, being able to break out. I think he's definitely more of somebody who likes to be a secondary carry, but that, again, just works so well because you can play through Quacker or you can play through Levitate in the early game, and you can feel relatively comfortable that Samikin's not only going to win in the 1v1 in mid lane, but also be useful in a lot of these team fights. The only player that I have like a real question mark on is Music, and it's not because I think Music is a bad player, but because I'm just not sold that Music is like a top 3 or a top 4 jungler in the NACL just yet. I was more impressed mechanically speaking with everybody else on this team last year. I thought his job got much easier once Levitate and Rovex started absolutely obliterating the 2v2, and I think when you watch this team kind of throw away some leads in the late game, part of it was just not really having a solid control of the map, which I do think kind of falls a little bit onto Music. Again, maybe he has this big breakout 2025 and he's even better than he was in 2024, but I think Music is one of the players that does kind of give me some hesitation for putting this team near the top 3. I think it's possible. Again, if Levitate breaks through and is kind of the Toasty Alex or the Surdy of 2025, then I'm not going to be surprised. If he's a top 3 player in the entire league, like an MVP frontrunner, an MVP candidate, I'm not going to be shocked at all. I think that that's absolutely possible. Him and Rovex could be the best bot lane in the entire league. Like, again, they're going up against some stiff competition, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. I think this could be the year that Quacker really kind of solidifies things and breaks out because the talent pool around him is a little bit easier to deal with. Samikin was on a great trajectory, and honestly, his floor is incredibly high. Music plays really well around the rest of this team. I'm certainly not trying to claim that Music is a bad player. He's still the number 5 jungler in the NACL. I think Blue Otter is obviously a really good team. My question is whether or not they're going to be able to make that leap again into being a great team. They were a team that we expected to be near relegation in summer of last year. They overperformed that. They leveled up into being a good team. If they can take another tier leap up into being great, that's really what you're going to be looking for. But at least for me, for now, in terms of a floor ranking, the highest I can really put them is number 4 at the top of B tier. I think of any of the teams in B tier, they're the one that's most likely to break into that A tier, that upper echelon. But at least for now, I do have them slightly below the top 3. But that is going to bring us into our top 3 teams in the power rankings. I think you probably could have expected the top 3 that is left, but the order is definitely going to surprise some people, and that starts here at number 3, because coming in at number 3, it is going to be near Airport, and I think a lot of people are going to have this team higher, and I'll kind of explain why. You know, number 1 through number 3, they're all just whatever order you kind of want them to be in. Again, this is a floor ranking for me, and I think the floor for near Airport right now kind of shockingly feels a little bit lower, and it's not for the reasons that you think. I'm not doubting a lot of the players on this team. I'm not going, oh, well, we haven't seen them in competitive in a while or whatever, right? Like, that's not the reason that they're sitting here at number 3. Honestly, I'll be quite frank, I'm just going to boil it down to one sentence. Can TF Blade be a top-tier top laner in the NACL? If he can, this team's probably number 1 or number 2. If he can't, then this team is probably number 3. It really is that simple of a calculation, but obviously, with this team being in the top 3 at all, there's a lot to like, so we can go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like TF Blade in the top lane, Spica in the jungle, Pobelter in the mid lane, double-lifted AD carry, and Biofrost at support. Of course, you've got so many NA GOATs here, and I want it to be clear, like, these number 2 rankings are not meant to be insulting towards the players that I'm ranking number 2, especially when you look at the rest of the talent pool left in terms of who's coming in at number 1 or who's coming in at number 2 in some of these positions. It's just really difficult for me to imagine a world where a couple couple of these players are any worse than number 2, and we'll kind of go over that. The first number 1 to talk about is going to be Spica, and the reason this number 1 is like really important to kind of contextualize is because I think the 2 best players in the entire league are both junglers, and it's really unfortunate that one of them has to come in at number 2 in terms of their overall position because they're likely the number 2 player, but I give Spica the edge in terms of being the best player in the NACL right now in terms of my expectations. Not only has he been very good, obviously at the tier 1 level, basically his entire career, I've been a big fan of Spica, I've been a big defender of Spica over the course of his career, but I do think that he was one of, if not the single best player in the OQs. In fact, I would definitely go to bat and say he was the best player in the OQs, and he absolutely decimated that tournament, even when he wasn't taking it particularly seriously, even in their final qualification series against the Friendly Fellas. Like, he was pulling out Darius Jungle, he was, you know, going absolutely insane with a bunch of these picks that just don't matter. Like, he wasn't even really trying, and he still was gapping every single player involved in those games. Like, he is so far and away, in my opinion, better than most junglers at this level, basically everybody not named Yuji, that I don't really think he's going to struggle all that much. And I think if there is a reason why you would consider this the number 1 team in the NACL, it's because you could reasonably consider Spica the best player by a long shot, an A+, an S caliber player if you really wanted to use that grading scale. I usually don't, but like, he is definitely deserving of that, and so he comes in as my number 1 jungler, and it's not like a lot of the rest of this team comes in all that far off. Again, the other highest rated player I have here is Doublelift down in the bot lane. There's going to be a lot of people that are upset and angry that I have Doublelift at number 2 and not number 1, but I'm going to be really clear about this. I really like Doublelift. I think he's still a fantastic player. I just think Tactical's really good. Like, it's really difficult for me to rank Tactical super low. I think he's been very good at the tier 1 level basically his entire career. Tactical, of course, took Doublelift's job. We'll get into him a bit later, but Doublelift coming in at number 2 is not meant to be any sort of insult. I think in almost any other iteration of the NACL, he would easily come in as the number 180 carry. It's just unfortunate there's one other ADC that I think has a ridiculously good track record throughout their pro career, but Doublelift is awesome, and I still think that he is a difference maker at a tier 1 level. Him paired up with Spica is completely unfair. I think the thing that impressed me the most for Doublelift is how willing he was to play weak side, basically for the first time in his entire career throughout the OQs, play a lot of Jhin, play a lot of Ashe, basically only play those 2 champions. Obviously, we know he can play a lot of the hyper carries. We know he can play basically every AD carry that's ever existed, but this team definitely felt a lot more comfortable playing around, you know, jungle and making sure jungle was in a good spot, putting a lot of resources into the top side of the map to make sure TF played, had a good matchup, and just allowing Doublelift to play something like Ashe and be on a little bit of a weak side bot lane to be able to win the 2v2 on their own. Who knows if that changes for the NACL when the competition level is just higher and when they feel like they might have to invest a little bit more into Doublelift. He has never been a weak side player throughout his career. That's really the only negative or complaint that you can give towards Doublelift's game, is that he just isn't a low resource player. He never has been. It doesn't really matter who else is on the team, but mechanically speaking, if you wanted him at number 1, I'm not complaining. And I think you could say a similar thing about Pobelter. Again, the only reason Pobelter comes in at number 2 is because there is established LCS or LTA talent above him that has looked really good recently, and I'm just not sure Pobelter is going to stand out in that way. But in terms of the way that he, you know, shows up on the rest of this roster, the way that he plays his role and like fills his job on this team, I think he's going to be the best player that they could possibly have gotten for this. Pobelter is a mage player. Don't get it twisted. He's not the most flexible player in the world, at least from a pro level. We know he can play things like Yone and Akali if he needs to. He does it all the time on stream, and he did it, you know, when he was really kind of, you know, thriving, I would say, in the LCS many years ago. But as a player, from what we saw in the OQs, just expect a lot more control mages out of him, allow Spica to be able to move around the map, and just let Pobelter be that scaling mid lane kind of insurance policy. I was really impressed with Pobelter in the OQs. He was probably the player that surprised me the most in terms of positives. You've got Biofrost in the support position. Talk about a player who surprised me in terms of the form that he was in. If you want him top 1 or top 2, I do kind of understand that. Again, he was really good in the OQs. My only holdback, or the hold up, I guess, is that I wasn't really all that big of a fan of Biofrost in his last couple of stints in Tier 1. It felt like he really was not particularly good the last time we saw him in like a full competitive environment. And again, like the OQs were really good, but you know, they didn't exactly play the best teams in the world. Respawn was probably the only team at that level that I think is like a Tier 2 caliber-esque team. Friendly Fellas is close, but they didn't really have to play off against a bunch of supports that were going to push Biofrost in the same kind of way. I'm concerned what happens when he goes up against some of the best supports in the league. Not that the supports are like unbeatable at this level, just that I really value players like Zyko and Zeyzal, who are going to be a little bit higher than Biofrost because, quite frankly, Zeyzal was better than Bio last time they played at the same level, and I really like Zyko, which we will get into later, but it's not meant to be an insult to Biofrost. If you wanted him at 1, if you wanted him and Doublelift and Pobelter all at 1, and you wanted Near Airport at 1, I'm not complaining. Like, I think that that's totally fair, but all of this really comes down to how good TF Blade can be. This is a guy with basically no competitive experience, playing in Tier 2, obviously, for the first time, but with a ridiculous amount of expectations. Now, he was really good in the OQs at being able to generate leads and, win 1v1 on the top side, but if he's not going to be a top 3 or a top 2 top laner, I have a hard time believing this team is going to be a top 1 or a top 2 team. You can't really have a weakness in terms of playing off against teams like Luminosity or, Dragonsteel DarkZero. Like, you can't really have an exploitable laning phase, and if TF Blade doesn't get counterpick, if they're playing blue side and he gets put in a bad matchup, is he going to bleed resources? We just don't really know about that at this level, and that's the only reason that they come in at number 3 for me, because, again, this is a floor ranking, and the floor of TF Blade is just lower than any other player in this top 3, group of teams, the top 15 players that we'll be talking about the rest of this video. But if TF Blade is what he was, not only in the OQs, but what we know his mechanical ceiling can be, this is a top 1 team. This is a team that wins the NACL in spring, wins again in summer, and promotes to the LTA. It's really not all that hard to imagine that happening. I talk about this upper tier as an upper tier for a reason. Spica might be the single best player in the entire league. In fact, I would bet on him being the best player in the league. I don't think Doublelift is that far off. I don't think someone like Pobelter is really all that far off. Biofrost is incredibly good. If TF Blade can complete this 5-headed monster for Near Airport, expect this team to dominate in the way that the name and star power on this team would make you think they would. But now we are down to the top 2 teams left in the video. What order will they be in? Well, for me, coming in at number 2, it is going to be Luminosity Gaming. Obviously, this does pseudo-reveal number 1 as well, which we will get into after this segment, but Luminosity is really, really good. I think that there are a lot of people that might over or underestimate this team for various different reasons. Somehow, some way, I've probably ended up in the middle of all of them. I've seen a lot of people put this team at number 1, basically without thinking about it too much, because every single one of these players was an LCS regular in 2024, and I've seen some people put this team at number 3 because they failed in the LCS. They didn't get the results that they ended up wanting, but to me, it's somewhere in the middle. I think that there are takeaways for individual players that I want to go over, and, I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that coming back down to Tier 2, a lot of these guys who have dominated Tier 2 for many years are going to continue to do so at this level. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Fake God in the top lane, Tomio in the jungle, Insanity in the mid lane, Tactical at AD carry, and Zeyzal at support. Again, most of this roster was on Shopify Rebellion in 2024. Fake God, Tomio, Insanity, and Zeyzal all coming down from that one team. It's kind of funny. Promotion and relegation very much does still exist, except Shopify got relegated into Luminosity Gaming, and Shopify just rebranded their own roster up on the LTA stage. But it is cool to see a lot of these players stick together, because I think there was a lot of optimism surrounding what they could have become. The problem ended up being that I think not only did their skill sets not match the meta, really at all, I think they ended up becoming really unfortunate in that regard, where Insanity couldn't play a lot of the things he was really good at, where Tomio couldn't necessarily dominate on the things he was good at. Fake God was not particularly good on the top side, but also just natural regression, where it felt like because the league shrunk, there weren't as many teams to take advantage of in a more negative capacity, and so they just didn't have the same kind of success. But I think there's a lot of reason to believe that they're going to be able to bounce back here in Tier 2. We'll start off with Tactical, because he is kind of the new addition, quote-unquote, to this team. He's the best player on this team. I feel pretty confident about that. I have him as the number 3 player in the NACL, only behind Spica and Yuji, who I think are more interesting to me as players, but Tactical is absolutely ridiculous. If you wanted to put him on the same level as Spica and Yuji, I think that that's entirely fair. I think sometimes we lose the plot on certain players. I think we've forgotten just how good he is because he's been on a bad organization for the last 2 years. I get that he had a little bit of a down surge on TSM, that the last couple of months on Team Liquid were really bad, but there was a reason this guy was considered a breakthrough prospect when he really emerged and went to Worlds and, was looked at as one of the top 1 or 2 AD carries in North America, full stop. What is really the difference between Tactical's rise and Jan's rise over the past couple of years, other than that Tactical wasn't able to maintain that same kind of momentum? There really wasn't a lot. And honestly, even on Immortals the past 2 years, he was the number 1 primary option, and every single win that team, that org ended up picking up was through Tactical. This guy still is absolutely electric. His mechanics are still absolutely absolutely insane, but he is a psychopath. He is going to trade his own life in a lot of instances that he absolutely should not. Now, that works in the confines of a team that has other stars that can kind of pick up the slack and be able to carry once you're down. Trading 2 for 1 in fights and then, taking a 4v3 with the rest of your team is generally positive. Jackie Love did it for many years in the LPL, but the problem for Tactical is that he was on Immortals, and once he ended up dying and it became a 4v3 for his team, they lost the 4v3, and hopefully that doesn't happen here on Luminosity. I still think that aggression is definitely going to be there. In fact, I would expect it to even ramp up in Tier 2 because I think he will just feel like he is way better than a lot of the other players that he's playing into, and for that reason, he comes in as my number 180 carry. If you want to double lift above him, I understand. Double lift's track record is longer, but I think Tactical's mechanics are insane, and I think his usage and his role on this team are going to necessitate him being what is likely the best performing AD carry in the NACL this year. The other number 1 for me is Insanity in the mid lane. I've always been a big Insanity defender. I think I've talked him up a lot on the channel. He is a little bit one-dimensional. The things he's really good at are not super flexible. He's never going to be a great control mage player or anything like that. He can play, Victor and Orianna and things like that. Like, I'm certainly not trying to sit here and say that he's awful at those champions, but when you think about what makes Insanity the number 1 mid laner in the NACL, or when he was the number 1 mid laner in the Academy League for Dignitas for many years, or when he was on, Immortals, or when he was on Shopify or TSM when things were kind of working out, it was the crazy stuff. It was Sion mid, it was Graves mid, it was things like Tristana, it was a lot of these AD carries coming out of the middle of the map, and while I don't think that's the most effective strategy in the world, I certainly think at this level you can still use it to take over. The only reason, again, that I put Insanity above somebody like Pobelter that I think is relatively close in terms of skill set is I think Insanity's mechanics and his carry potential are just a little bit higher. I imagine his usage on this team is going to be a little bit higher, but there's not any sort of major difference between Insanity at number 1 and like someone like Pobelter at number 2. In fact, I think Insanity probably has a lower floor than someone like Pobelter, whose floor is just ridiculously high, but Insanity just, to me, is somebody that I would expect to really re-break out again at this level. He's always been so good at Tier 2. I see no reason for that to change. Other players who have always been good at Tier 2, basically the rest of this roster, Fake God has been a Tier 2 icon. He's like the classic 4A player right now. For those of you who don't know baseball terms, AAA is like the league below the major leagues in baseball, and if you're too good for AAA but a little bit too bad for major leagues, you're kind of considered to be like a 4A player. Fake God has really embodied that for me when it comes to North American League of Legends, where he feels like he's always going to dominate Tier 2 when he is here, and I'm going to talk him up and talk about how he should be getting, Tier 1 jobs like I have been every single time he's been at this level, but then he gets a Tier 1 job and he's just not really able to make the most of it, whether it was on 100 Thieves, whether it was on Dignitas, or whether it was last year on Shopify. It just has never gone well, and quite frankly, it's his laning that has not been able to hold up, and I don't really think that's going to change. That being said, I still think he's super valuable for this level, even if I am a bit lower on him now than I really have been at any point in his career. I still think you're very lucky to be able to have him in Tier 2, and I think he's going to be able to make a gigantic impact. This guy has been nothing but a superstar at the Tier 2 level every single time he's played here. And I think you could say the same thing for Zeyzal, who I think is in a very similar spot to Fake God. Now, I think Zeyzal theoretically could have more upside out of the support position. This is a guy who's made top 4 at Worlds before with Cloud9. I just don't think that that's still there. I think Tactical and Zeyzal is really intriguing as a bot lane because Tactical's aggressiveness could play into Zeyzal's favor. He's obviously known as a very vocal shot caller, and so maybe kind of reining in Tactical, utilizing his mechanical superiority to be able to generate leads could be a big advantage for Luminosity, but again, I think Zeyzal's just solid. If you wanted to put Biofrost above him, I totally understand that. I'm not all that in on where Zeyzal's recent form has been. I just don't think it's been nearly as good as maybe it should be. Again, I'm a bit out on him in the same way that I'm kind of out on Fake God in that way, but he should still be more than good enough to be able to excel at this level, and that really just leaves Tomio, and somehow, someway, Tomio is the player that I have the most amount of questions about. I just don't feel great about Tomio, man. I just got really, really worried after watching him play in Tier 1 last year because the problems that he had in his game should have been expected. Like, we were all so high on Tomio in Tier 2. He was a bit one-dimensional. He is a really good Maokai or Sejuani player. He's kind of built in that Tarzan mold where he's super aggressive in the early game, mostly out of facilitated position. So he'll pick Sejuani and then play really aggro for the first 12, 13 minutes of the game to be able to generate leads for his laners and then be really useful in team fights as well. The problem with that is that if he's out jungled in the early game, he doesn't really have a lot of like pressure or prio in a lot of those instances, and especially because I think jungle is so stacked at the top of the standings. Like, to be a top 1 or top 2 jungler, you have to be better than Spica and Yuji. I just have a hard time believing that Tomio is going to be that right now, but he could be. Again, he was a top 1 jungler last time he was in tier 2. Who's to say he can't do it again? And if Tomio is the player that I'm the most concerned about when it comes to this team, that's a pretty good place to be. So for now, they come in at number 2. I think someone like Tactical could really accelerate them up to number 1 if you really wanted to put him there. I think if Insanity has a completely absurd year, I'm not going to really be all that surprised. If Fake God's the number 1 top laner, I won't be shocked. If Tomio ends up being a lot closer to what Yuji and Spica are than being like where I have him in my rankings, I'm not going to be shocked. There is a lot that still could go right for Luminosity, but I'm just a little bit jaded based off of what a lot of these players' recent form is, and so for now, at the very least, they come in just shy of number 1. But that's going to bring us to our final team of the video, and the team that I have at number 1 in my power rankings. Obviously, by process of elimination, you know who it is. It is DarkZero Dragonsteel, the new merger between Maryville, Dragonsteel, and DarkZero. Obviously, I was already excited about this team before a lot of the merger stuff. Having an org, like an official org to try to get in to the LTA with, is really cool, and I think DarkZero is a cool org to do so, but this roster is still unbelievable. That we have to remember, this was the best team in the NACL last year. I know that some people kind of forgot that because Fear went to Americas and did better than Dragonsteel did. They kind of really underperformed when they were playing at the Americas tournament, but there was a reason that this team ended up winning the NACL in the summer split, and quite frankly, they did not get worse. They lost their star AD carry, but they kept their star jungler, and they replaced him with another really good, young, up-and-coming AD carry. I just feel pretty good about having this team at number 1 right now, so let's go ahead and go through it. Their lineup is looking like Zamudo in the top lane, Yuji in the jungle, Spyrax in the mid lane, Sajed at AD carry, and Zyko at support. We'll start with the players that are staying here, most notably Yuji. There's really no way to start this other than Yuji. We gotta have the conversation about Yuji. First of all, I feel so garbage looking at this image right now in front of me and seeing Yuji and then the number 2 below it, because there's just no justification for him ever being the second best jungler in a tier 2 league. That's how ridiculous it is that Spica is down here in the first place, but that should show you how highly I view Spica, because I view Yuji as an A+ at this level. There is no excuses for him not to be in a tier 1 league at this point. It's absolutely ridiculous. I know that there's visa problems going on right now. I know that there are a lot of teams that would have probably signed him had things not gone that way in the offseason. A bunch of LTA teams were looking at him. I'm sure Disguised or, Leon would probably have loved to pick up somebody like Yuji. And we also know that a ton of LEC teams were looking at him as well. Giant X was the one that was reported, but we know that there were multiple LEC teams that wanted to bring Yuji on, and yet here he is sitting here in the NACL somehow, some way, because visas just are not fair, and he got completely screwed over in that regard. But it's to the benefit of DarkZero Dragonsteel, absolutely, because they still have an absolute star player in the jungle. When you're talking about somebody who has absolutely massacred this level for multiple years, that's Yuji. Again, he is a tier 1 caliber player, not just a tier 1 caliber player, but he would be a top 3 jungler in tier 1 right now. I've talked about it all year long. I think he would be an upgrade to a team like Team Liquid that just won the LTA. That's how good Yuji is as a carry, as a facilitator. He does it all. He's just absolutely unreal, and he's got great chemistry with the rest of this team. Obviously, him and Spyrax have been a duo for a very long time. And I'm definitely really excited that Spyrax is coming back here. They have Toasty Alex, who I think has a lot of interesting upside. I don't think there's a huge mechanical difference between Spyrax and Toasty. In fact, I think Toasty probably is better individually as a player, but I get wanting to start Spyrax here because of the consistency and the synergy with him and Yuji. Spyrax is just a really good player. He's kind of like Pobelter in the sense that he's never going to be the main character on a team, or at least he's never asked to be a main character on any of his teams, maybe because he plays with Yuji, but he is really good at playing for jungle. Like, he is unreal at shoving wave, making sure that he's in a good position to roam around the map, and then creating macro plays. He is one of the best roamers out of the mid lane position. The player I've always compared him to is Niski. I think he's pretty similar in that regard, where the shove and roam style just comes so naturally to him, and that's really good in the current meta. It's why Yuji has so much help and so much success at this level, because he gets to play with the mid laner who really wants to give a lot of time and attention to him. You have Zamudo on the top side, who is without a doubt at this point the most mechanically talented top laner in the NACL. Again, I don't really want him at number 1. If Tenacity were in the league, he would be at number 1. If Dokla were in the league, he would be at number 1. But Zamudo ends up being at number 1 because a lot of those top laners don't end up with jobs. I like Zamudo. I don't love Zamudo. I've pushed back on some of the Zamudo hype, but last year was such a breakout for him. It's really hard to not put him as number 1 in terms of the players that are in the league at the current moment, because we saw what it looked like when everything was clicking, and I think especially playing with the rest of this team again, playing with UG and Spyrax, who were very, very willing to kind of give him a lot of resources on the top side again. Like, I expect a similar production type of year for Zamudo. Now, outside of this circumstance and scenario where the rest of the team is ridiculous, would he be able to perform like this? I'm not quite as sure. Again, he's all mechanics, sometimes no brain. His laning is ridiculous, but when he does lose, it can be a bit inconsistent in terms of the results from him. But again, I've already talked so much at this level about how I would rather have somebody who can win, like, a lot rather than a player who's consistent, because you're just not going to find a lot of consistent top laners. And in terms of raw mechanics, you're going to have a hard time finding anyone better than Zamudo, and he really showcased that last year when he was given an easier job, an easier opportunity. This was his first real top team opportunity, and he absolutely made the most of it. So, top side of the map you feel good about, and Zyko you still feel good about. In fact, I probably feel way better about Zyko than most other analysts. I'm all in on this guy. Like, Scary Jerry obviously deserved a lot of the credit for last year's bot lane, and, you know, he deserved his spot in the LTA, but I think Zyko deserved a spot right next to him in the LTA. To me, it's absurd that one of them gets promoted and the other doesn't. Zyko had a higher floor coming into the NACL. Jerry had to grow into being a superstar. I think Zyko has just been one of the best supports in, like, tier 2 for quite a while. This guy is unreal. He's incredibly good, and I think he's going to work his magic once again on Sajed in terms of how I think this bot lane will go. Sajed obviously coming off of another pretty good situation with FlyQuest Challengers last year, being kind of the young gun on a team full of veterans, or a team full of, you know, players that were trying to compete, and that team not necessarily reaching their goals isn't the most encouraging thing in the world, but Sajed was not the reason for that. He still is a bit underwhelming as, like, a number 1 type of player if you're looking to win the NACL. Like, I don't think he can be your number 1 primary option as a carry on a team if you want to win the NACL, but I do think on this team he's basically option number 3, at least in terms of resources, and that's a pretty darn good place for him to be, and he does have good enough mechanics where I think he could grow into being even better. Again, playing with Zyko I think is going to make this bot lane, like, really click. Like, Sajed had a really good time last year playing with Chime. I don't think he's really downgrading all that much going to Zyko. I think it's a little bit because Chime is just ridiculous and unfair in terms of how good he is, but Sajed's a totally fine, totally serviceable player. I think this is a bit of a make or break year for him if he's not a star by the end of this year. Maybe you're not really looking at Sajed that highly because he has been put in a bunch of good situations throughout his time so far in tier 2, but man, is this team talented. Like, I feel like we're talking about them as if, oh, they lost Scary Jerry, there's no way they're going to be able to run back their success and their performance from last year. To me, this is the team to beat in the NACL right now. It's not Luminosity, it's not Near Airport, it's DarkZero Dragonsteel. I think that UG is still one of the players to watch in terms of MVP frontrunners. I think Zyko's the best support in the league. I think Zamudo, until proven otherwise, is the best top laner in the league. I think Spyrax plays great in terms of his role on this team and what he offers the rest of this team. And Sajed, if he can just be what he was for FlyQuest last year, I think this team is going to be just fine in terms of options and in terms of resources. Are they maybe a little bit weaker going from Jerry to Sajed? Yeah, I believe so. I don't think this team is as good as they were last year, but in terms of overall picture, I think the NACL is weaker than it was last year, and so I still really value Dragonsteel, I really value Maryville, and I still have them as favorites to win the NACL right now. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL 2025 Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed. There's going to be a ton of disagreements. Let me know what they are down in the comment section below. Who is rated too high? Who is rated too low? What players am I over or under hyping in terms of what I talked about in this video? I'm always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on all of that stuff down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We'll be covering every single game of the NACL over the course of the entire year. Once per week, we'll be having our NACL weekly recap, and we're going to be doing it for the 4 major regions as well. So LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL, just like we have all throughout the year, throughout winter so far. We put out the LPL version of this video a couple of days ago. You can check that out on the channel as well. But we're going to be going through all of those regions, so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all